What? Really? Hello and welcome back. I am Mr. Sosotris, and today I am finishing up my spoiler-filled recaps of all of Gregory Maguire's Wicked books in anticipation of Wicked for Good, which is coming out this week. So, today, for our last video, we're doing Elphie, A Wicked Childhood. This is the prequel, in-between-quel sort of thing that takes place during the early years of Elphaba's life. Now, I've said this before, but I'll say it again. This is a very spoilery recap, and it's going to spoil everything in the story. So if you haven't read it before, please read it before doing this video. I will say this is one of my favorite books in the series. I really genuinely enjoyed this one. So if you're sort of uncertain about whether or not you wanted to read it first, I would say this is worth reading. I genuinely really liked this one. It has a good emotional climax, and the arcs are good, and it gives a lot of insight into the complicated family relationships at the heart of the story. So if you're uncertain about whether you want to read this one, I would say this is a good one. And I had a great time reading it. So I am really excited to do this recap. So, the story so far, because this is an in-between quill, this book takes place sort of in the early chapters of Wicked. It takes place after Nesseros is born, basically. So it starts there, and then it goes up until Elphaba is sort of about to join, or like about to start at Shiz University. So it doesn't start with like when she was born or when she was a toddler. That's all covered in Wicked. This kind of fills in the gaps in the original book, where there was lots of sort of jumping ahead. It was sort of like, oh, and then this happened, and then moving ahead, that kind of thing. So there's nothing really in here except for one event that sort of doubles up on something that happened in Wicked. But again, it's told from a totally different perspective. So we're not just getting kind of the same scenes over again. We're sort of seeing them from a different perspective. So Elphie at this point is about 3 or 4-ish. And the story takes place after Turtleheart has been sacrificed by Kray's followers of the Clock of the Time Dragon to end a drought that had settled on Munchkin Land. And so they've now moved to Quadling Country. And Elphaba's father, Frex, is sort of hoping to minister to the people. He's also sort of looking for Turtleheart's family, but that's kind of in the back of his mind. It's not really his main mission. And in terms of when you should read this book, I would say read it after you've read Wicked, because the book is very well aware of things that will happen in the future, and there is a couple like flash forwards that reveal stuff that happens at the end of Wicked or in Wicked. So if you have not read Wicked, I would say read that first and then read this one. If you wanted, I really like approaching this kind of at the end of my recaps of all of the other books. So I finished the 4 original Wicked books and then the 3 Another Day books, and then at that point then you can go back and do this, and it just sort of is a nice finale, honestly, to the whole series. It kind of brings things full circle, and I genuinely really enjoyed reading it kind of at the end. But it is kind of a prequel-y thing, and aside from like stopping in the middle of the first section of Wicked, reading this and then jumping back, I don't know if that would be a very fun time reading. So, read this at least after you've read Wicked. You can read it at the very end. You could even probably read it after Out of Oz, and then read this, and then go into the kind of Another Day series, because it does end back in Oz, but it takes place mostly in another land. So, it's up to you, but I would say don't read this before you've read Wicked. If you haven't read Wicked yet, read that first. That one is incredible, and it's still good. Also, a bit of a spoiler, and I think fans of the books understand this already, but if you are fans of the musical, and the musical is genuinely really good, and I love it. But if you're only familiar with the musical, this is not a prequel to the musical, okay? This is very, very different. The timeline is all different. And while I think it's sort of, there's not a lot of stuff in this one that I guess contradicts stuff in the musical, so you could sort of read it and assume that the events that are going to play out are going to kind of tie into the musical, but there's a few references, things like Kiamoko and stuff like that, where it's pretty clear that this is the book version of the Wicked timeline, not the musical version. And so because of that, it is also darker, it is more morally complicated, there is lots of ambiguous characters, there's lots of characters who do bad things but aren't evil people. They just sort of, they make mistakes in their life, and you know, they're flawed, complicated, regular people. There's just a lot of ambiguity as well. There's certain things that aren't fully explained, but you can kind of infer from what's around it. And so I've seen a lot of reviews of this book that say it's bad, or it's poorly written, and it was confusing and they didn't like it. And I get the vibe that a lot of those folks are folks who are either just familiar with the musical, or we're hoping for something that fits in more with like the Wizard of Oz books or something like that. This is like, the Wicked series is much more complicated and adult, and it wrestles with deep kind of philosophical subjects. This one doesn't as much. There's a bit of it, and we kind of see Elphie's kind of introduction to sort of philosophy and like class struggle and all that kind of stuff. But it's very, very different. And so, you know, manage your expectations and go into this understanding that this is a work of like literary fantasy. It's mostly a character sketch. The book is actually quite cozy for most of it. And so it's all character arcs and personality and interpersonal relationships, and the way that one's view of the world crystallizes over time, and that's kind of what it's about. So, you know, just want to get everybody on the same page, because I see a lot of negative reviews of this and of the original Wicked books that just say that like they're bad and they're poorly written, and they're, the one that always cracks me up is when people say that the books are like super adult and should be like X-rated, because like there is sexual content in the series, but it's all fade to black, all of it. Like there's not any like explicit stuff. Like I've read romance novels, like tame romance novels, that are more explicit than the original Wicked, you know, the original Wicked books. It's just because it is very frank in the way that it addresses certain things, and so there'll be like descriptions of like nudity or whatever, but it's like anytime any character is like gonna sleep together or anything, it's always a fade to black thing, and it just cracks me up when people are like, you know, I couldn't stand the first book because it was just this smutty adult X-rated awful book filled with sex. And it's like, really? It's not. There's like 2.5 sex scenes in the first book, and they're all fade to black. So, you know, even the thing in the nightclub with the tiger and the dude who gets sort of handcuffed to the tiger, it cuts off before things start happening. It's all in the buildup of that moment, and you know, the expectation and his fear and everything that's going on. Like that's sort of the scene that everyone kind of talks about. Like, oh, it's so awful and anything. Anyways, I'm getting off on a tangent here just because media literacy is failing, and I need people to understand that books do things and they elicit responses in readers by doing different things. And it's okay to have books where people make mistakes, or where characters do bad things but aren't necessarily bad people, or, you know, it admits that there's sort of darker aspects of society, and that's just a thing that we have to live with, and there's no easy answers sometimes, and Anyways, moving on. Moving on. So a refresher on characters of where we are. So we've got Elphaba's father, who's Frexbar. He's not her birth father. And again, major spoilers. So if you have not read Wicked or have not seen the musical, run away screaming now. But Elphaba's birth father is the Wizard of Oz. And Nesseros is her sister, her next youngest sister, and she's the daughter of Turtleheart, who's a quadling glassblower who had sort of made not a pilgrimage, but a journey to Munchkin Land to sort of see if he could find a way to stop what was happening to the quadling country, because the Emerald City is very ruthlessly sort of taking over the area because it has rubies, and so they want all that wealth for themselves and all that kind of fun stuff. Elphaba's mother is Melina. She is the daughter of a wealthy family. She ran off with Frex, who's kind of a penniless minister, to sort of make her family mad. She just is sort of very impulsive and free-spirited, and also she has many lovers. So yeah, Elphaba and Nesseros are both the daughters of two different men who are not Frex. And let's see here. Oh, and Turtleheart also has a bit of an affair with Frex himself. It's sort of discussed in this book. It's not a major topic, but there is sort of a connection between him and Frex. And it's not treated as anything bad. It's sort of a confusing thing that happened to Frex in his past. He's sort of really drawn to this guy. Apparently, Turtleheart was just like super hot. And Frex he's a very repressed, buttoned down person to the point of mania, very super mega religious, and he kind of opened himself up to Turtleheart in a way that he'd never opened himself up to anyone, even Melina. And I think that encounter still confuses him to this day, and so that's one of the reasons why he's sort of focused on finding out, what the deal is with Turtleheart's family, because he wants to tell them what happened to him. There's also a character called Nanny. Her real name is Cattery Sponge. She's one of my favorite characters in the whole franchise. She came to help Melina raise the children and ended up getting kind of roped into a full-time position when she kept having children. So, I also have to read the dedication to this book because it's very sweet. Here we go. Okay, so the first book was... No. Not the first book. Sorry, the second book, Son of a Witch, was dedicated to the cast of the musical Wicked, the original Broadway cast, because Maguire genuinely loves the musical version. It's very different from his book. It's kind of exploring different topics, different themes, and it ends completely different, and the characters have completely different things happen to them, but he genuinely loves it. And so the second book was dedicated to the whole cast of Wicked. And this book, this is so sweet. The dedication reads, "For Idina Menzel and for Cynthia Erivo and for all the Elphabas past and to come." And I love that so much. Also, the audiobook version of this is narrated by Cynthia Erivo, who has just a gorgeous voice. I haven't listened to it yet. I just read I have the ebook, so I've just read that version. But I definitely want to get the audiobooks eventually, because I would love to reread this kind of with her narration, because I think it would be just a really great experience. So I thought that was really sweet. So, okay, all right, let's get into the synopsis of Elphie. So part 1 is called Encounter Day. So when Elphaba was born, she had really sharp teeth like a shark's. And that's mentioned in the original Wicked book. And so at this point, she's about 3, and those teeth have fallen out, and she now has just normal teeth. And there's kind of a sense of the family wants to forget that she had those kind of strange teeth when she was born, because she's green, and she has this sort of instinctual aversion of water. And like water isn't just that it's like a superstitious thing. Water actually harms her when it touches her skin. So she's like violently allergic to water. And so because of this, the family just sort of ignores her. She's left on her own. Her father is very distant. He cares more about his sort of holy mission than being close to his children at all. Melina's attention is mostly on herself. She's a very selfish person, but also she's not necessarily selfish. She is a flawed person because she made this impulsive decision to run away with Frex to kind of make her family mad, and now she has to kind of live with the consequences of having to be like, you know, a mom with children and responsibilities, and she doesn't really want any of those responsibilities. And so she just kind of compensates for it by sort of drawing attention to herself and talking about all the things that she needs help with and everything. She's very, very self-centered, and that definitely hurts the way that the children see her. And she's also miserable at having left Munchkinland at this point, because they're in Quadling country and it's very damp and humid and warm, and it's kind of like living in the Florida Everglades, basically, is kind of what this landscape is like. And she just she's not thriving there. Nanny sort of gives all her attention to baby Nessa. So when Elphie was born, she was born green because when Melina and the Wizard of Oz, whose name is Oscar Zoroaster Diggs, that's right, he had this green elixir, which is basically just seawater from his world, but he was passing it off as kind of a magical elixir. And so they have kind of a dalliance. She drinks some of this elixir, and because it's from another world, it has kind of an effect on her. And so Elphaba was born with green skin and an aversion to water in Oz, because she has this kind of connection to the real world, or not the real world, but our world, basically. And that's why later on, when she's an adult, she can read the Grimoire. She has kind of memories, like she can sort of connect with our world in a way. And so, anyways, that's not in this book, but she's green because of that. And so when she was born, Melina thought that she did something wrong herself. And so when she was pregnant with Nessaros, she eats pinlobble leaves, which is like an anesthetic kind of thing. And she chews these leaves constantly to kind of hopefully, get through the tragedy of having to give birth to another child that she's determined is like, she's terrified is gonna come out looking like Elphie did. But when she's born without arms. Otherwise, she's fairly normal, and she just doesn't have any arms, so she has trouble balancing when she walks, and she can't really do anything for herself. And so Nanny gives all her attention to Nessa, because as a baby, she does need a lot of attention, and she does need to be taken care of, because at this point Nessa is about 2. And so she gets all the attention, and Elphie is sort of left alone. And she's a bright, inquisitive child. She's always asking questions, but she's very often shushed and ignored and just sort of treated like a nuisance by everybody. Nanny is a little bit nicer to her than her parents are, a little bit, but even still, Nanny is she's over it. All of her attention goes to Nessa. We get a little bit of a look back at how Frex and Melina met, as well as a look at the Quadling people Frex hired to help them. So one of them is a cook called Boozy, and that's not her real name. It's like a mispronunciation of her Quadling name, which is much more complicated, but everyone calls her Boozy because they don't want to bother to learn how to pronounce her name. And I have to admit, I did look up the name. It is in the books, like it is mentioned what her real name is, and I don't know if I can pronounce it. So, I'll put it up here so you can see it, but I don't know how to pronounce that. So, all right. So, Frex's mission in the Quadling country is very unpopular, and so occasionally bands of Quadlings armed with weapons menace the family. They're trying to get them to leave. And one occasion, the family is attacked while Frex is kind of away. They're able to hide, but Elphie's separated from them, and no one's able to find her until after. She's returned by the kind of chief of the Marauders, who finds her kind of unnerving and strange. And In that moment, a strange kind of crocodile-like creature, it's called a crocodilos, appears and seems sort of entranced by Elphie. It's like he comes up behind her, but is sort of like waiting for her to give him instructions. There's some sort of connection between her and him. And the quadlings kill it before anything can happen, because obviously it's like there's a child there and there's a creature behind it. And so they kill it and they leave it to kind of sink into the bog, because they don't want to. It's a very strange kind of creature. And there's a suggestion that it may have been a sentient animal, capital A animal, but it's never confirmed. And it also has these kind of strange kind of protuberances on its back. It's like these sort of sharp spines, and they just think it's kind of like a mutation or something. And so they just kill it and leave it in the swamp. They don't want to take the meat for anything like they normally would. After this, sort of the quadling party it loses interest in the family, because they were mostly looking to just kind of scare them away. They didn't really necessarily want to hurt them. They want them to leave, because, mission trips are sort of a colonialist enterprise, and they are coming to their land just to kind of change their mind and change their religion, and they don't want them there for good reason. So in all this kind of hubbub, Nessarose has sort of gone missing somehow, and Frex appears back, and he sort of reveals that he was trapped in like a circle of like water buffalo who had kind of trapped him in while he was bathing, and so he couldn't put on his clothes because there was this like ring of big animals kind of roping him off, and eventually, they kind of lose interest, and it's all good. We'll come back to that in a little bit. So they find Nessa eventually. She was put to float in the water inside a shield, like a shield, and they're not sure who put her there, but she's safe. And there's also sort of questions at this point about sort of what kind of influence Elphie has on the crocodrillos. It seemed to be under her spell, and we don't know. We get a bit of a flash forward at this point. We learn that this is the crocodile that's eventually sort of stuffed and hanging in Elphaba's kind of lab, her magical workspace in Kiamoko, the castle where she dies. And it's sort of, somehow she got that back. We'll address that a bit later. So now we get to part 2, called the Hex. So during a conversation between Nanny and Melina, Elphie hears Nanny use the word hex, and she asks what it means. She's brushed off at first, but eventually she figures out that it refers to magic. And so at this point, Elphaba is maybe like 7 or 8, and Nessarose is like 5 or so. And she tells Nessa, because they're sort of becoming close at this point, she tells Nessa she's going to hex a small stone to turn into a plum. And Elphie just thinks she's having a bit of fun, but, the next morning the stone does look like it's turned into a plum. And so they're able to sort of bond over this moment. Elphaba is much more, she asks questions, and she's wondering if maybe someone switched it, and, maybe it wasn't magic. Nessa, on the other hand, she's a little afraid of the concept of magic, but she does like the idea that she could perform magic, because it means that she would have agency, because she doesn't have arms, and so much of what her life entails is people doing things for her, and she wants to be able to kind of do things for herself, to not have to rely on anyone all the time. And so Elphie sort of suggests that maybe Nessa made the magic happen, because she really believed it could, because Elphaba didn't really believe. She was just kind of maybe playing a bit, and it's not really sure. But later on, they're telling this to their father, and he is very super mega religious, and he thinks magic is all like evil and wrong. He becomes angry. He thinks they're lying. And Nessa takes her father's side in this. She sort of refuses to admit that she could possibly perform magic, even though Elphaba says, it might have been Nessa who did it. And she's like, oh no, it wasn't me. I would never do that. And so you see kind of how things go. Elphie is very much kind of the outsider, and Nessa is always going to kind of have that support from her parents. Elphie tries to ask the quadlings about hexes, and Boozy isn't really able to give her much. She kind of has a roundabout conversation that, as a small child, she's not going to understand, and so she doesn't really get it. At this point, Melina is pregnant with her 3rd child, and this child is actually Frex's son this is like his first child, even though, he doesn't fully know this, but he sort of suspects. Elphie goes back to her tent at this point, and she finds that the plum has turned back into the stone, and wonders if there was any magic at all, and is wondering if maybe Boozy like replaced it just to play a trick on them, and it's kind of an unusual situation. So after this, Elphie sort of has this moment where she feels a little jealous of Nessa, who's sort of cared for and treated with physical affection by everyone, while Elphie is sort of ignored. She watches Nessa getting wrapped in flannel after she has a bath in water, and she thinks about how different she is from her, because when Elphaba has a bath, she has to kind of be bathed in like scented oil that's kind of like rubbed off, and then that kind of thing, and her hair is cleaned with like egg whites and I think oil as well, I don't know, and so like she's still able to get that attention from Nanny, who's she's still young enough that she gets bathed by Nanny, but she feels like she's missing out on something because Nessa gets like a totally different experience, and she feels like it's a closer experience, and it's something that's more tender. And we jump forward a few years later, and there's a moment where objects around their kind of camp start disappearing, or they're kind of moved around. And Elphie is immediately blamed for this, and nothing she can say convinces them otherwise. They all think that she's the one who's stealing things. And so she decides to investigate what's happening, and she suspects like a poltergeist or something. So one night she's out singing kind of a nonsense song that also feels like her attempt to sort of hex the answer into reality. And a monkey appears. And there's something about this monkey. She doesn't quite know what it is. She calls it a polter monkey, so she maybe thinks it's a ghost monkey of some kind. But there's something about this monkey, and something happens back in her camp. It's her mother who's kind of throwing a fuss again, and the monkey disappears. But in its place is one of the things that was missing. It's like a pair of tongs. And so Elphie goes and takes it and brings it back and explains what happened. And of course, everyone just thinks she's making up excuses to hide that she's been stealing. So I just tell her, no more stealing. Now, Melina's pregnancy is quite advanced at this point, and her health is not good. So before, she was very much sort of inventing reasons to get attention, but at this point, she is genuinely not doing well, and her health is not good. And so she does require a lot more attention. Elphie and Nessa sort of have an odd relationship at this point. And maybe it isn't that odd if anyone who's had siblings, but like they clearly need each other, and they are able to find joy in each other's company, but there's also a lot of resentment between them as well. They, Nessa has a very different sort of relationship with her parents than Elphie does, and also Elphie has the use of her arms, and so she has more independence than Nessa does, and so there's this kind of divide between them, but they are still able to get along, and there's things that they're able to connect over. So Melina goes into labor. It's a very long labor, and while Elphie is sort of hiding away from the hubbub, she meets the monkey again and discovers that it can talk. So it's a capital M monkey. It's sentient, and they kind of have a little conversation, and it doesn't really go anywhere because the monkey doesn't really know what it wants, but it does sort of imply that it was looking for Elphaba specifically, and it wanted to talk to her because everyone else in the camp would chase it away, but it feels like Elphaba would kind of understand it. And they have a conversation where he talks about the stories of like angels that Frex talks about in his sermons, and the monkey says that he kind of likes that idea. He's like, what if monkeys had wings, and they could fly away from predators, and they could be safe, and wouldn't that be a great idea? And the name of the monkey is Operos, or Opros, and he kind of casually suggests that he wonders if Elphaba could maybe use magic to help them, and it seems more like he's sort of teasing her at this point. It's really hard to say sort of what his intention is here, because he's sort of keeping his distance. And at this point, he also he hands her a plum, and kind of implies that he was the one who switched the plum for the rock and made her think that she transformed it. So and he makes this kind of cryptic comment about there's other forms of hexes than these or something. So I think he's more talking about like, I feel like you're someone who maybe could stand up for animals, in the future, maybe something like that. But again, it's very implied, and she's a child at this point, so she doesn't really understand what's going on. But the next morning, Elphaba sees kind of a vision, not a vision, but she sees sort of the ghost of her mother departing with sort of a spectral monkey. And this is such a beautiful description, because the way she describes it is she sees them as reflections in the water, but there's like nobody to cast the reflection. So she sees them walking away and the monkey sort of leading her mother away into the forest, but it's only in the reflection of the water underneath, and there's no one, like no physical person that's like walking to cast the thing. And it's one of the most beautiful descriptions of like watching someone's soul departing. And I just love that. And the fact that it's a monkey leading her away is sort of interesting, because then it's sort of implied, was the monkey an actual monkey, or was it a ghost, or was it something like a spirit that was here waiting to guide Melina's soul away when she passed away in childbirth? Like, it's sort of unclear what happened there, but you can kind of interpret it in different ways. But so at this point, so Melina has died in childbirth, and Frex is left alone to raise Shell with Nanny. So now we get to part 3, which is called The Vegetable Pearl. And at this point, Frex moves the whole family to the quadling city of Ovals, which sits outside the marshland a little bit, so it's a little drier. Things have kind of changed at this point. So because Melina's died, and also his ministry has taken his funding away, because they kind of are trying to recall him back, but he's sort of gone rogue at this point. He wants to do his own thing, and he still wants to continue ministering to the people, but he also wants to spend more time kind of tracking down Turtleheart's family, because he wants to tell them what happened and how he feels like he's responsible for his death, even though he's not really, but he does feel like he's responsible. And so at this point, Elphaba is about 13, and so we've jumped ahead quite a bit. Nessa is like 11 or 12, and then Shell, the baby who was born, is 4 or 5. Okay. So anyways, so at this point, they've moved to the city. Things have changed a little bit. So because Frex no longer has funding from the church anymore, a lot of the quadlings who were working for them, their staff has kind of been let go. So Boozy isn't there anymore. The only person who's there is Nanny. So it's just basically Nanny, Elphaba, Frex, and Nessa and Shell, and that's it. But Elphaba's old enough at this point that she can sort of help out a little more. She kind of takes on the cooking duties, and she's not very good at it, but she's learning. And they find a place to stay with this widow. Her name is Lay, who kind of welcomes them in. Her sons are off working in the vegetable pearl gardens or orchards or whatever it is, where I think they grow under the water maybe. So the vegetable pearl like crops, however that is. And so she's basically alone, and she doesn't really have anything to do. So she has this big open house, and so she lets them live there for fairly cheaply. And so they start asking around for information about Turtleheart's family, and Turtleheart is a translation of a quadling name. So they don't even know what his actual name was. They just know that it translates into Ozish as Turtleheart. And so she comes across a fabric shop whose proprietor seems like he knows something, but he isn't really forthcoming. And at that point, someone throws a rock through the shopkeeper's window, and it sort of disrupts the whole thing. Elphaba offers the keeper some of Melina's fine dresses that they're carrying around they don't need, in exchange for information about Turtleheart's family. But he's too annoyed at the broken window, and he sort of shoos her away. He thinks that maybe her father threw the rock through the window, and is sort of frustrated. And so later on, there's a moment where Elphie and Nessa are sort of walking down by the water, I think like a river, and Nessa falls into the water, and Elphaba can't jump in to save her, and Nessa, of course, can't swim because she doesn't have arms, but Nessa's saved by a talking dwarf bear who is swimming in the water. There's 2 of them, and the appearance of another animal, because this is a talking animal, reassures Elphie that she wasn't sort of making up the story about the polter monkey. And her father insists that animals can't talk at this point, which is so silly because, like, everyone knows that animals can talk in Oz, but he's just so determined to like force the world to conform to his sort of narrow worldview that he just tells the children that there's no such thing as talking animals. And anytime they bring it up, they say that he says that they're lying. And so she learns from the bears that they were sort of sneaking into the city to look for food. And so there are other like talking animals that live in cities like the Emerald City and all that stuff, but it's not a good situation for them. They're not treated very well. And so the bears have to kind of work covertly and sort of sneak around to find food. And then at this point they leave, and Elphaba's sort of intrigued because she wants to meet them again, but she doesn't know what they're like where they're staying, basically. So she goes back. Obviously Frex doesn't believe her. He says that she's lying, and Shell even backs her up at this point and says that he saw them, and you know, Frex is just ridiculous. But Nanny at this point sort of reassures Elphie that, you know, talking animals are real, and that her father is just he's sort of becoming weird. Ever since the loss of Melina, he's sort of become much more controlling and strange, and so he's not very logical or rational at this point. So a bit later on, Elphie does meet the bears again, and they think she's come to sort of bring them food, but she wants to ask why they saved Nessa, even though other humans are cruel to them. And they say it was just sort of a random decision made in the moment, but they explain that they have to pretend to be sort of lowercase a animals to survive, because they avoid most people, but they do think that they can trust Elphaba. They see her, and there's something about her that they think that they can sort of trust her, and so that's why they sort of broke their disguise, so to speak, to help Nessa. They explain that the Emerald City sort of hired animals to do manual labor in Quadling Country in like the ruby mines, but it's basically slavery, and it's much better to, you know, even though you have a job and lodging and stuff, it's not worth it, because they don't have freedom. And so they escaped, and they live kind of outside the city limits, sort of pretending to be wild animals, just to avoid being mistreated by humans. So we jump ahead a little bit, and Elphie brings a collection of Melina's clothes to the clothier from before, to trade for information about Turtleheart's family. And the merchant sort of ropes Elphie into working for him in order to pay back the cost of the broken window. And he says he'll give her the information afterwards, and he'll, you know, spend the time while she's working for him to look up the information. And so she goes back and tells her father, and her father agrees at first. And even Lay, the landlord, she says that she knows the merchant, she can trust him, you know, she knows that he's you know, a good man, and so he's vetted. The merchant's name is Unger, and I have to say he is my favorite character in this book. I love him so much. He's so great. And my like synopsis of things is not going to do his character justice, because he's sort of like the grumpy old guy who genuinely cares, but he doesn't want anyone to know that he genuinely cares, kind of thing. He's so good. I love this man so much. So Elphie really genuinely likes working at the fabric shop, or actually it's like a clothing shop. He like makes clothing from scratch. She starts off with sort of basic cleaning, and eventually learns how to measure and cut fabric. She picks things up really quickly, and then she begins helping to sew. There's this festival in this area that involves sort of these ceremonial dolls with these sort of fabric wings on them, and so she learns how to sew these wings onto these dolls, and gets quite good at it, and so they're able to fulfill a lot of orders for this. And her mood improves, she feels better, and in a rare moment at home, he hears her singing to herself and realizes that she can carry a tune very well. Now this is something that's a little surprising, because in Wicked, there's no reference that Elphaba had a good singing voice, so I think this might also be an homage to the musical version. But maybe it's something she did as a child, I don't know. But so he has her sing kind of a unionist hymn, and she does well enough that he sort of gets an idea. So he plans to hold sort of open air services in like a communal area next to a school, and he has her sing hymns as a way of kind of bringing people in. And he tells her to call into the fabric shop and like cancel, like to say she can't make it to her shift, but she says this holiday is coming up and she's really needed, but he doesn't care. He dresses her up in this awful stiff garment that's like it's made out of like carpet. It's so horrible. It's stiff and rough and terrible, and it used to belong to Melina, but it doesn't fit her, and it doesn't fit Elphie at all because it's made for someone who's an adult, and it's sort of folded up around her and it just looks ridiculous, and she hates it. But she wears this awful thing up on stage and does sing, and it genuinely brings people in. And so what Frex does is he sort of tailors his sermons to cater to the political struggles of the Quadlings. Their lands are being destroyed by the Emerald City, who's looking for rubies, and he sets up unionism as sort of a way to, or like a path to standing up to the Emerald City. He says like the unnamed god can help you all find strength to stand up to the Emerald City. And so they're not terribly impressed by Frex, but they do genuinely enjoy Elphie singing. And there's a really funny moment where she tries singing a song in the local language, and the people sort of don't like it as much because it sort of kills the mystery of it. They kind of like when it sounds exotic and unknowing. And so they like it when she's singing in a language they don't understand because it's sort of, you know, more compelling somehow, you know, something like that. Anyways, it's kind of like how, you know, in Lux, you know, Rosalia doesn't sing very much in English because if she did, it would kind of kill the epic grandeur of that album. Anyways, moving on. So Frex tells Elphie that she has to quit at the clothing shop, and she's sort of devastated by this. She goes to tell Unger. He's sort of understanding. He says, like, your debt is paid off at this point. I understand that. He is frustrated. He's going to lose a good employee. He'll never admit that, but, you know, he tries to be like, yeah, sure, you know, I never liked you anyways, even though it's clear that he's really kind of broken up at losing like a good employee and someone that he genuinely cares about. And he, as kind of a final parting gift, he offers to alter the horrible garment that she's wearing because it's just terrible. And he says he can fix it to make it so it actually fits her properly. And what he does is he like cuts like chevrons out of the thick, heavy fabric, and then sews those into like a sort of more simpler muslin garment. So the pieces of the old garment sort of go all the way around and they act as sort of weights. And so it turns it into sort of a dress that genuinely looks really good. And it fits her well, and, you know, she likes it. He makes it something pretty. And as she's waiting for the garment to be remade, there's this young man who comes in who's about her age. I think he's like 2 years older than she is. And he has kind of a flirtatious conversation with her, but she does not pick up on any of this at all. She thinks he's just being strange, and she doesn't really know how to respond to him. And so, you know, he eventually kind of leaves. You know, he doesn't want to push anything. And she's sort of like, what the heck was that sort of moment? And so after this, Unger gives Elphie the information that she wants about Turtleheart's family. And he kind of couches it in the guise of like telling her that she has to be the one to place the order for the replacement window for his shop. So like she's paid for it already, but he wants her to place the order so that, you know, the glass can be delivered. And so he gives her the money for it, and he also tells her that he thinks that she's intelligent and inquisitive, and he says that it would be a really good idea if she pursued an education somehow, because he thinks that she has a lot of potential and it's sort of being squandered right now. He sort of feels bad that she's having to, sort of do the things that she's doing and not able to thrive the way he thinks that she could. He's kind of more of like the dad figure to her than her own father at this point. Unger is great. She doesn't think this is impossible. She makes a flippant comment that she wants to go live with the dwarf bears, and Unger sort of lets slip that the dwarf bears were chased away after a story got around that they tried to drown Nessa, which isn't true at all. Elphie is sort of horrified at this, and he tries to reassure her. He kind of says, oh, maybe it was something else. Maybe I heard the story wrong. But she kind of knows the truth. He doesn't want to hurt her feelings, but, you know, he didn't realize that she knew the bears and liked them. So they part ways with a hug, and they both keep up this pretense that they don't like each other, but their hug is so warm and genuine and kind, and it's just, it's such a good moment. I love it so much. So now we get part 4, the final section of the book, called The Fledgling. So Frex is disappointed in this altered garment that Unger made. It looks good, it fits Elphie well, and so of course he thinks that, you know, it's too revealing and something. And he also sort of doubts Unger's intentions. He keeps thinking, he's like, why would you be kind to her? Because, you know, that must mean he's kind of a creep or something. And even though Unger was just genuinely a kind person and wanted Elphie to have a good life, but Frex is so caught up in his own severe interpretation of reality that he sort of assumes that anyone who's kind to Elphie has ulterior motives, because he just can't understand anyone wanting to be nice to her. And so Frex doesn't want to have anything to do with him, but, you know, Elphie does say that they have to get and place an order for this window for him, and while they're there they can talk to the Quadlings and get some information about Turtleheart's family. And so he doesn't think that's a good idea. He doesn't want her to go, and eventually, it's Lay who steps in and says, I'll go with her, because Nanny can't leave because Shell is sort of becoming a bit of a terror at home, and there's just no one else who can go with Elphaba to place this order with the glass blowers. And so Elphie also kind of wants to learn about where the dwarf bears have gone and what happened to them. And so she wants a chance to get away so she can kind of do some investigating of herself. So Lay at this point also has sort of been kind of trying to insert herself into the family as kind of the de facto mother figure. And she's not necessarily a bad person for wanting this. You get the feeling that she's lonely and her children are all away and her husband's dead, and she wants a family. She wants to be a part of it, but Frex has zero interest in her and doesn't notice her in that way. And so that's, I think, where she sort of comes across as not evil or anything, but just kind of a little naive and a little out of touch with the reality of things, because she's kind of trying to insert herself into the family where it isn't necessarily appropriate for her to do that. But Nanny's kind of annoyed at her, but she's okay with Lay taking Elphaba to go see the glassblowers. So along the way, Lay and Elphaba have this kind of strange conversation where Lay asks her about her mother, and she says, oh yeah, I remember her, and, you know, tries to kind of recall her mother, even though it's very distant and it's affected by the kind of distant relationship we had with her mother, where they weren't close really. She was more just a figure in her life. And Lay sort of makes this odd comment about how it's always good to sort of, you know, let the past stay in the past and move on. Obviously, she's trying to kind of prime her for being like, you know, what if you had a new mother kind of thing. But Elphaba doesn't really care at this point. She's kind of lived to learn, or she's learned to live without parents at this point, basically. So anyways, they reach the glassblowers village, and while they're looking around and talking with the man in charge, who's kind of the head person, he shows her a glass gazing ball, and Elphie looks into it, and she's able to conjure up a vision of her mother in the glass, and she doesn't know what this is. It must be some kind of magic or whatever. She asks the man if she can buy it, and he says that he can sort of see into her future somehow. The Quadlings do have kind of a mystical quality to them. He says he can see into her future somehow, and he knows that she will eventually own a glass ball like this, but it won't be this one. And so he basically just tells her to kind of be patient. The glass ball that she does have later, which we see in Wicked, is a modified version of a looking glass that Turtle Heart made for Melina. And so she kind of has it melted and blown out into like a glass ball. And but that's later. That's much, much, much later. But we kind of get this reference to the thing that you'll have later on. So on their way back, they place the order, and then they come back, and Elphie sort of gets Lay to admit that she was the one who kind of made the complaint that had the bears driven away, and she also sort of is more overt about, you know, her intentions to sort of become the children's stepmother. And so Elphaba just doesn't trust her. She thought the bears were kind and she wanted to befriend them, and she's really mad at her for being the one that sort of spread this lie about them, you know, trying to drown Nessa and having them chased away. So once they get back, Frex learns about the location of where Turtle Heart's family is kind of located. They don't get specific information, but they do get sort of a general whereabouts. But he's sort of unwilling to pursue the lead. He's kind of caught in this deep depression at this point, and he just doesn't want to function or do anything except his ministry stuff. So life continues on. Elphie really misses her job at the clothier's shop at this point. She continues to sing for her father, but it just isn't fulfilling. One day when she's singing, she sees the boy that she met earlier in the store in the audience, sort of watching her, but you know, they don't talk much. It does turn out that he's kind of the son of a very wealthy family, and but she doesn't really know much about him otherwise. So she brings up the question of education to her father at this point, and he agrees, much to her surprise. But because of her skin color, she's sort of only allowed to audit classes, and she has to sit kind of on an outside porch and sort of just listen to the class through like curtains. So the class is inside. She's not allowed to like interact with the other students because her skin is green and they think that it'll like be a distraction for the students or whatever nonsense. And so she's forced to kind of sit outside on this little porch and just kind of listen to the classes, and that's it. And because her father's kind of church services things are right next to the school, she still has to sing in his services and then kind of sneak over to the school afterwards and, you know, make it to the porch without any of the kids seeing her. And so she's only getting kind of a fraction of an education, but it's better than nothing. And she learns quite a bit. She is really surprised at how quickly she's able to learn, and she sort of realizes that she is capable of more, something that she didn't really think she was able to. Back at home, Shell is becoming more and more destructive and strange. He's a very troubled boy. And Nessa has also grown very spoiled and entitled. Maybe entitled isn't the best word. Maybe resentful is a better one. Because she sort of feels like Elphaba has all of the good opportunities and she doesn't have anything, because Elphaba gets to go to school and she doesn't get anything. And like they can't really afford to send another child to school, but and Elphaba really isn't getting a good education. She's just kind of having to sequester herself away and listen to things. But regardless, Elphaba is still doing really well. It's kind of the only thing that she has that's not tearing her down and making her feel small, and so she genuinely enjoys it. One day she comes to her spot on the porch and she finds this beautiful porcelain tea set that someone sort of left out there. And she deduces that it sort of belonged to a student who maybe brought it with her to school, and it was distracting in a classroom, and so the teacher kind of set it outside. And so she takes it home with her. And she lies to Nanny and says that it was a gift from a friend. And of course, Nanny's like, you don't have friends. No one would give this to you. But anyways, Elphie and Nanny sort of have a tea, or not Elphie, Elphie and Nessa have a tea party together with this. And Lay, you know, makes them this tea, and they have this really sweet kind of moment. And Shell kind of wants to join in, but they say, you know, this is just for us, you know, go do your homework kind of thing. And they place it on a shelf for protection, and then Elphie's going to bring it back the next day. And Shell, in the night, angry, smashes the entire thing to pieces, and so she can't return it to school. But it is also her fault, because she did take it home without asking. So the family of the girl who owned the tea set is furious. They demand action. Elphaba is expelled from the class, but Nessa is allowed to take classes. So at this point, Elphaba only has her father's sermon and like singing for it, and it's just kind of killing her soul softly. And so she grows to really resent this. She has nothing else to look forward to. At one point, she kind of is sneaking back to the school because she wants to kind of listen in, somehow, because she wants this knowledge. And she comes across the boy that she met earlier, and his name is Paraisi Taor, and they discuss sort of class struggles and philosophy. He's like maybe 14 or 15 at this point, and he's reading a philosophy book about class struggles, and she thinks that's really interesting, and they have a really good conversation. And it turns out that the reason he's kind of there is because all the other boys in this town all go and harvest vegetable pearls, which is kind of like pearls except they grow in plants. I don't know. And he has like a chronic life-threatening lung condition, and so he isn't able to do that, and so everyone else is able to go and do this, and they're working, and he kind of is just left to sort of wander around aimless because he can't really do anything because his health is so bad. And Elphie finds him really interesting, but she can't explain why, of course. But the philosophical hello kitty the philosophical discussions that they have together sort of change her view of the world in a positive way, and she really wants to kind of learn more about how things work. And at this point, Nessa, because she gets to go to classes, she kind of sees herself as like the perfect sister, and she kind of looks down at Elphie as sort of the tragic failure who just couldn't cut it, and so there's a rift between them. It starts to grow at this point. Shell's violence gets worse. He goes from smashing inanimate objects to killing animals in increasingly gruesome ways. And he also starts stealing money from the people in town, or which kind of hurts their impression of Frex. And they stop donating money to his cause because, they're like, we don't have any money left because someone, maybe you, keeps stealing it. So at this point, Frex becomes angry and he plans to leave because the people have kind of turned against him. He's really upset at this point. He seems to think that they have accomplished nothing with this mission trip, and especially if they're so quick to turn on him, he sort of feels entitled to their devotion and is mad when they don't give it. And Lay, the landlord, is sort of hurt and angry at this point that Frex is leaving because she had sort of intended to be a part of the family. He doesn't see her that way, and he just kind of dismisses her. And I mean, his reasoning is that he thinks that if she leaves with them, then the people in town will think that she was a part of the thefts, and so she will never be able to come home again, and so he's kind of protecting her in a way, which I guess kind of makes sense. But he also doesn't thank her for all the work that she did helping to raise his children for the past few years. So it's not a very good parting. You kind of feel bad. So Elphie goes to say goodbye to Unger. This is the last time she's going to see him. And he tells her that the boy that she's been meeting, Paraisi Taor, he's in really poor health and he's not expected to live long. But he does mention that he talked to his family, who's very influential, and he mentioned that he noticed that Elphaba was very inquisitive and intelligent, and he thinks she would do really well at school. And so he tells her that with their help, there's a talk that she might be able to go to Shiz University, which she wouldn't otherwise have been able to afford, and get kind of a real education away from her family, which Unger really thinks that Elphaba needs. And she's overwhelmed by this. She's not used to people caring about her or her future. And so they leave the town and they move to a big city called Ovals, which is also in Quadling country, because they're kind of that's on the way to where they think Turtleheart's family lives. And along the way, they run into Boozy again, and she kind of leads them to Turtleheart's clan, who's just kind of outside the city here. And Frex is sort of able to explain what happened, and it's kind of anticlimactic because Frex has sort of built up this whole thing as like he wants absolution for being the reason why Turtleheart stayed behind, and so thus was there to get captured and sacrificed by the the crazed munchkins. But the chief sort of does this really brief sort of atonement ceremony thing where she like flogs his face with like a reed or something, and then kind of says, all right, the matter's done, you're free. And he's like, okay. But it does genuinely seem to kind of help him, because he's able to sort of put aside some guilt and move on, and he feels a little bit better about himself, which is good. And also someone in that town gives them the body of the crocodrillos that died early on when Elphaba was a child. It was sunk in the bog, and so now it's sort of shrunk down. And it's very much, this is sort of one of those like prequel-y things that it feels a little too convenient, because the crocodile that was in Elphaba's like workspace in the castle was kind of a miniature crocodile, and so in this one they're like, oh yeah, it must have shrunk in the bog as it dried, and all the spines on its back fell off, and so there you go. But so that's kind of one of those things where you're kind of like, okay, yeah, I get it. It's like, do we really need that side plot that explains why she had a crocodile hanging above her head as an adult? Maybe not, but it does add some element of kind of the future, or like a reminder of the future to the story. So anyways, Nanny accepts it and promises to hold on to it until Elphie is older, which she does get when she's older. So at this point, they make their way to the city of Quoyre, Quoyre. I have no clue how to pronounce this. Quoyre, maybe. It's the Quadling capital, anyways. And there they meet Para-Isi To'or's uncle, who is kind of the one who ordered them to leave the city of Ovals, but he didn't do it because he personally disliked them. He was just kind of the one who was given the paperwork, and said, all right, sure, and then that's it. So he doesn't really hold any ill will towards them, but he kind of takes Elphaba aside, and takes her to a little cafe, and they have a conversation, and he explains that Para-Isi To'or, the young man that she sort of found so interesting, had succumbed to his illness and had died, and he explains that before his death, he talked to his family about how he wanted Elphaba to somehow be able to go to school because she felt like she deserved it. And then also his uncle explains that Unger, we love Unger, also kind of made inquiries into ways that he might help fund her education. So he's also willing to sort of contribute to helping her pay for her university education. So she talks to her father, and he's sort of unsure, but he does agree eventually. And so she's able to go off to school. We jump ahead a little bit, and we move to kind of her first day on campus. And this section is kind of presented very dreamily. And even like the last section, there's a part where it's like everything after this point is conjecture. It's like maybe this happened, because it's all sort of hazy. And I think there's sort of the suggestion that like the haziness is sort of being like, there's other ways you can tell the story after this point. So he's kind of admitting there's the story of what happened, but then there's also the musical version of what happened. And so maybe that's what happened, who knows? But it's kind of a sweet way to kind of blend the timelines, so to speak, without resorting to like any multiverse shenanigans or anything. So we see like, Elphaba sees humans and animals talking. She sees Dr. Dillamond. He's not named, but it's just like you mentioned a goat, in a blazer, or like in a vest, talking, and obviously that's Dr. Dillamond. There's also a fleeting brief moment where sort of another student sort of careens in, wearing pink, and sort of drifts past her. She doesn't she doesn't notice this other student, and that person doesn't recognize her, but it's kind of implied that it's Glinda. And that is also kind of a nod to the musical, because Glinda's entrance in the song Dear Old Shiz is where she's sort of wheeled in on like a pile of her luggage, and she sort of drifts on stage, and she's singing this one note, all this kind of thing. But anyways, it's just a blink and you miss it moment. So it's not, he doesn't dwell on that, but it's clear that's Galinda. And at this point, kind of Elphie is sort of, she's feeling really overwhelmed, and so she says that she's like not going to make friends, she's not going to rely on anyone else, she's going to do the best that she can, and she's going to just rely on herself, kind of thing. And we know that's not true, because she does eventually make friends. And she kind of is able to patch things up with Nessa. I think that actually happens right before she goes to Shiz, but they sort of are able to sort of bury the hatchet a little bit. There's still that resentment between them on some level, but they're able to sort of put the past behind them a little bit. And Elphaba does tell Nessa, he says, you need to, she says, you need to get out of this house, you need to go off on your own if you can, and you need to see the world because you deserve kind of a better life than this. Because her father, he's not a bad person, but he's just very distant, and he's also a very constraining, controlling force. And so she tells Nessa that she needs to kind of go off on her own. So, and then Elphaba leaves, and she goes to start her first day at dear old Shiz, and that's how the book ends. It's so good! I love that final moment. It doesn't feel like cheesy or corny. A lot of times you have sort of prequel-y things. They'll have sort of moments that are almost too cute, where like they're like, we know what's going to happen next, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And this doesn't really do that. It just sort of leaves things open-ended, and it doesn't talk about what's going to happen later on. It just says she's there, and she was determined to sort of make the best of her life going forward, and that was it. And I really, really, really liked the way that he ended this one. It was so good. And even though, because the way I prepare for these videos is I do like a skim read of the whole book, it takes me about like 4 hours. You're able to sort of just skim through, and I kind of write down the plot points as I kind of come across them. So I'm sure there's things that I missed or whatnot, but the main plot was fairly easy to reconstruct here, because I did recently read this. I finished it like last week, so it was all still fresh in my head as well. So when I was skim reading it through, I kind of knew what events to look for, so that kind of helped. But I genuinely really, really liked this book. It was very thoughtful and very poetic. It didn't have quite the level of like sarcastic, satirical wit that some of the others do. I know the Another Day books sometimes lean into that really extremely, especially with like Iskanary, who was really sarcastic and always had like a quip or comment. Nanny, of course, is also a very quippy character. And in the original Wicked, like, I don't think people appreciate the humor in that book, because they just are so focused on like the dark political discussions and the complex depictions of like the treatment of second-class citizens and the treatment of women and everything. And so people lose the fact that it's got this very kind of witty, sarcastic, dark humor that's like simmering underneath the whole thing. And this one, it was the perfect blend. It sort of captured that feel, like it very much felt like it was part of the world, but it didn't feel like it was just the author just indulging himself too much and like being too quippy or too fun or too proud of himself for how clever everything was. It just felt poetic in a very natural way. Everything flowed really well, and the dialogue felt really good, and it was just beautiful. It had some of the most like gorgeous imagery of the whole series, and it was a really great book to kind of end this journey on. So that is Elphie. If you've read it, I'd love to hear what you thought about it, because I genuinely really enjoyed it. When you read reviews on it online, a lot of them aren't good, and I've talked about this before, but I feel like people just weren't expecting a literary character study. They were expecting something a little more fun and funny and silly, but it wasn't. I don't know. It was exactly what it needed to be, and I really appreciated it for how it fit into the bigger story being told in the books. But anyways, with that said, I will let you go. Wicked for Good comes out this week, so I am going to go see it. So if you have seen it, or if you're going to see it, like in the comments, let me know what you thought of it, because I will have seen it too, and we can talk about it. It'll be good. So anyways, I'll let you go. I'll see you next week, and in the meantime, happy reading. Bye.